Chapter 1. Dusk over the Golden Horns. Close your eyes for a moment if you have not already. You are standing on the shore of the Golden Horn, the curved inlet of water that cuts through the heart of Istanbul like a slow-moving thought. It is evening. The sky above you is the color that comes just after sunset and just before night, not fully orange, not yet dark, but something in between, a bruised gold that hangs over the water and the city like a held breath. The year is somewhere around 1550. The man his people call the lawgiver, and whom the Europeans have begun calling magnificent, has been sultan for 30 years. Under him, this city has swelled and rebuilt and swelled again, until it holds perhaps 300,000 souls within its ancient walls, with more living beyond them in the hills and suburbs on either side of the. It is one of the largest cities in the world. You are looking at the skyline from the water. There is the old church of the Byzantine emperors, now a mosque for nearly 100 years, its enormous dome rising above everything else, the rim of it catching the last amber of the sky. To its left, closer, the new mosque complex of himself has been rising for several years now, its domes and half-domes clustering upward like a conversation between the earth and the sky. Its 4 minarets are very thin and very tall, and the evening light catches their stone tips and makes them look like lit candles. On the water around you, boats are moving. The Golden Horn is alive with small wooden vessels, fishing boats, ferries, rowboats carrying provisions from across the water. The oarsmen do not hurry. They have learned the pace of the strait. You can hear the dip and pull of oars, the lap of water against wooden hulls, the creak of rope. And then, without warning, it begins. From the nearest minaret, not one of but an older one, attached to a smaller neighborhood mosque just up the hill, the call to prayer rises. A single human voice, carried by the open air of the evening, curving upward and then settling and rising again. The muezzin has climbed his spiral staircase in the dark interior of the minaret and stepped out onto the balcony and cupped his hands around his mouth. And what comes out of him is not exactly singing and not exactly speech. It is something older than both. And then another voice begins from a mosque further away across the water in, and then another from behind you from one of the neighborhood mosques on the hill, and then another and another, until the whole air above this city is layered with these voices, not synchronized exactly, not a choir but an echo, each one overlapping the others like rings spreading across still water after you have dropped a stone. This is the night prayer. The last of the 5 daily prayers in Islam, and the one that marks the official beginning of the night. You do not need to be Muslim to be moved by what you are hearing. You only need to be here, on the shore of the Golden Horn, in the warm evening air of a May or September evening, and feel the voices fill the sky above this enormous, ancient, breathing city. This is where our night begins. Before we travel any further, if you are finding this peaceful, if this is helping you settle and rest, it would mean a great deal to me if you subscribed to the channel and left a like. It takes only a moment, and it helps this channel continue making these videos. And please, write something in the comments. Tell me where you are in the world right now and what time it is where you are. I am always genuinely curious. Write it in the comments when you have a moment. Now, let us continue. Chapter 2. At Nightfall. Let us stay with that sound a little longer. The word comes from the Arabic Ezan, a call, an announcement, an invitation. Every day it comes 5 times. Before dawn, at midday, in the mid-afternoon, just after sunset, and finally in the full dark of the evening. The night prayer call is in some ways the most significant of the five, because it divides the world into before and after the ordinary time of the day and the sacred time of the night that now officially begins. In 16th century Istanbul, there were hundreds of mosques. The great Ottoman traveler, who would write his 10-volume account of the world in the following century, recorded 3,000 mosques in the city at his time of writing, a number almost certainly exaggerated, as numbers tend toward the impressive rather than the precise. But even if the true number was a fraction of that, it was still a city carpeted with prayer spaces, from the enormous imperial mosques on the hilltops to the tiny neighborhood masjids tucked into the corners of markets and residential streets, serving the men and women of a single block. Each one had a muezzin, and each muezzin, as the light changed, climbed his minaret and called. The technology of the call was entirely physical, no amplification, no recording, no mechanism beyond the human throat. A good muezzin was selected partly for his voice, partly for his knowledge of the proper modes of recitation, and partly for his ability to reach the highest notes of the adhan cleanly and without strain, because strain in the call was not merely aesthetically displeasing, it was disrespectful. The call was addressed to God and to the community at once. It had to be right. In practical terms, what this meant for the ordinary resident of Istanbul in 1550 was that the functioned as the city's clock. There were no church bells ringing the hour. This was not a European city. There were no mechanical tower clocks on the hills. Time was kept by the sound of prayer 5 times a day, and by the sun and the moon and the stars when you could see them, and by the domestic rhythms of fire and food and light. You knew it was evening when the came. You knew it was very late when the sound faded, and all that remained was the ordinary silence of a city at night. After the residents of the city who intended to pray gathered. In the mosques, the men laid their prayer rugs on the stone floor and stood in rows behind the imam and bowed, and prostrated themselves in the carefully prescribed sequence of prayer. In private homes, those who prayed at home, many women prayed at home rather than in the mosque, which was acceptable and indeed common, laid their prayer rugs on the carpet or the bare floorboard and faced in the direction of Mecca, which in Istanbul was roughly to the southeast, and prayed privately and quietly. The prayer itself took perhaps 10 to 15 minutes after it was done, the night was yours. And in this city, the night was understood to be a distinct and separate world from the day. There is a phrase in Arabic, attributed to Ali, that became part of the Islamic understanding of the night. The night was made long so that the worshipper could stand in it. The night was not simply the absence of day. It was its own territory, with its own obligations, its own opportunities, its own dangers. The voluntary prayer performed in the depths of the night, when no one required you to rise, was considered among the most meritorious of all religious acts precisely because it was hardest. Rising from warm sleep in the cold dark to pray when no one was watching, this was a measure of genuine devotion. For the mystics of the Sufi orders who lived in there, around the city, the night was not just a time for prayer. It was a territory of encounter, a liminal space where the boundary between the human world and the divine world grew thin. They had their own relationship with the darkness. We will visit them later. But for now, as the fades and the last light leaves the sky, and the stars begin to emerge above the dark water of the Golden Horn, let us think about what is happening across the city at exactly this moment. The gates are beginning to close. Chapter 3: Closing the Gates. Istanbul was a walled city, and its walls were taken seriously. The original walls were built by the Byzantines, the Great Walls on the landward side, constructed in the 5th century and never successfully breached until the Ottoman cannon brought them down in 1453. The Ottomans inherited these walls and maintained them, and beyond the old defensive function, they had taken on a new administrative one. They defined the boundary of the city at night. When the gates in the walls closed at dusk, they did not reopen until dawn. There were multiple layers of enclosure in Ottoman Istanbul. The outermost were the city walls themselves, the great stone fortifications that ran from the Golden Horn to the sea across the western peninsula. Their gates were staffed by janissaries, the elite military corps that also served as the city's garrison, and they closed at sunset. Anyone who was inside the walls at that point was inside for the night. Anyone outside was outside, but the gates of the city walls were only the beginning. Within the city, the larger neighborhoods were themselves enclosed. Many residential quarters had their own gates at the end of their streets, which were also closed at night. This created a nested geography of enclosed spaces, each one sealed within the next, like the layers of an onion. The neighborhood gate kept the safe from the street. The city gate kept the city safe from the countryside. The walls of a particular building kept its occupants safe from the neighborhood. The market districts had their own closing routines. The market streets where particular trades were grouped together had gates at both ends, and these were locked at dusk by the guild officials responsible for each trade's district. The locksmiths locked the metalworkers' quarter. The spice merchants locked the spice bazaar. Each trade was responsible for its own. And then there was the Grand Bazaar. We will visit the covered bazaar in its own chapter. But even from a distance, even in passing, the nightly ritual of its closing deserves a moment of attention. The Grand Bazaar was not simply a large market. It was the largest covered market in the world, a roofed city within the city, containing thousands of shops and stalls along its dozens of internal streets. By the time was Sultan, it had already reached impressive scale, and it would continue to grow. When the Grand Bazaar closed at dusk, it did so with a deliberateness that matched its importance. The great wooden gates, each one tall enough for a loaded cart to pass through, were pulled shut and locked with iron bolts. More than 100 soldiers, paid by the guild associations that occupied the market, took up their posts inside. They would patrol the interior through the entire night. No one entered without an imperial order. The lamps were extinguished. The bazaar, which during the day was the loudest, most crowded, most overwhelming place in the city, became a sealed vault of silk and spice and gold and silence. Outside its walls, in the streets of the city, the effect of all this closing was profound. Movement became dangerous in a way that it simply was not during the day. Ottoman law, documented in the administrative records that he examined in his scholarly study of Istanbul's nocturnal life, was clear. Anyone walking the streets after dark without a lantern was subject to questioning by the night watch. The presence of a lantern was itself a statement of legitimacy. I have a reason to be here. I am visible. I am not trying to hide. The absence of a lantern was suspicious by definition. It did not matter if you were the most honest person in the city. If you were walking the dark streets without a light, they would want to know why. For the wealthy, this was less of a problem. A man of substance walking home from a dinner at a friend's house would have his servant carrying a lantern ahead of him, possibly two servants and a second lantern for safety. The light announced his status as much as it fulfilled the law. For the poor, the calculation was harder. A single olive oil lamp burning all night cost money. Tallow candles, the cheaper option made from animal fat, with a smokier flame and a less pleasant smell, were affordable for ordinary households, but even tallow cost something. And in a city where the daily wage of an unskilled laborer was measured in small silver coins, the question of how many hours of lamplight you could afford each evening was a real one. For some, the homeless, the transient workers who slept in the covered spaces of the city, the night streets were navigated by memory and touch, feeling along familiar walls in the darkness, avoiding the watchman's rounds by staying still when you heard the tap of the staff approaching. But for most people, the closing of the gates was not a hardship. It was simply the shape of the night. You were home, the door was shut, the lamp was lit. The world outside could be whatever it was. Inside, in the small warm circle of lamplight, the night was yours. Chapter 4: The Men of the Night. Somewhere in the city right now, if you listen very carefully, you can hear him. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of a wooden staff on cobblestones, slow, deliberate, regular, not hurried, not casual. The sound carries a particular quality in the empty streets of the night. It announces itself before it arrives and echoes after it has passed. In a sleeping neighborhood, this sound, heard from the distance, is both reassuring and faintly commanding. It says, someone is watching. The night is not unwatched. This is the night watchman, the Ottoman institution of the night, as indispensable to the city's functioning as the muezzin or the janissary or the guild master. Writing of Istanbul in the mid-17th century, counted 12,000 in the city. 12,000. Even accounting for well-documented tendency toward impressive numbers, and his statistics should always be treated as impressionistic rather than precise. The number speaks to the scale of the institution. The city that slept was watched by an army of watchmen, covering every neighborhood, every major street, every market district, every gate. The Ince era would have been a recognizable figure to anyone who lived in the city. He wore a turban and a distinctive coat of animal skin. Sources describe a green coat in many accounts, heavy and practical for long nights outdoors in any season. He carried 3 tools, a wooden staff, which served both as walking stick and as the instrument that announced his presence on the cobblestones, a lantern hung from his hand or from a hook on his belt, and a whistle for raising the alarm if needed. His rounds were structured around the hours of the night. As each unit of time passed, the Ottoman timekeeping was organized around the division of the night into its traditional segments. They would tap his staff on the ground. A particular number of taps, or a particular pattern, announced to anyone listening that the hour had changed. In a world without mechanical clocks or tower bells marking the quarter hours, this was how time was transmitted through a sleeping neighborhood. The sound of the staff was the city's night clock, but there was far more than a clock and more than a simple crime deterrent. lists with characteristic enthusiasm the full range of his duties, and it is a list that reads less like a job description and more like a portrait of someone the community genuinely depended on. The assisted at births, called out in the night when a woman went into labor. He would help summon the midwife, carry water, stand at the door. He was present at deaths as well, helping prepare the body for burial according to Islamic practice. The washing, the wrapping in the white shroud. During the winter months, he helped poor households split firewood, coming by with a small axe and spending a few minutes at work before moving on. He carried water to households that needed it. He ran small urgent errands when a family had no one else to send into the dark street. And during Ramadan, he took on his most celebrated role. In the last hours before dawn during the holy month, he became a musician and a poet. He walked through the sleeping neighborhood carrying his drum, the large double-headed drum of Ottoman music, and beat it in patterns that were designed to wake the deepest sleeper. But the drum alone was not his art. He also recited short folk couplets, rhyming verses composed for the occasion. Each neighborhood had its own tradition of these poems, and with a gift for poetry and a strong voice was treasured. The poems woke you gently, reminded you of the significance of the hour, invited you to rise and eat before the fast resumed at dawn. Imagine being a child in Istanbul in the weeks of Ramadan, lying on your mattress on the carpet, half asleep, and hearing through the wooden shutters the beat of the drum coming closer, and then the voice of the beginning his poem, singing through the street outside, and your mother already awake in the room's darkness, stirring the embers of the brazier to heat the morning meal. There was not universally beloved. Like any institution of authority, it could be abused. There are records of extorting small payments from households in exchange for looking the other way or harassing residents with their questions. The line between a legitimate night watchman and a local bully was maintained largely by the character of the individual, and not every individual maintained it. But in its ideal form, the institution of the represented something genuinely humane about Ottoman urban life. The idea that the night was a community responsibility, that someone needed to watch over the sleeping city, and that this someone should be not merely an armed guard but a neighbor, present at births, present at deaths, present at the cold winter mornings of Ramadan, tapping his staff through the dark streets so that everyone could sleep a little more securely. Tap, tap, tap. He is somewhere out there making his rounds, moving through the neighborhood while you sleep. Chapter 5. The Coffeehouse by Lamplight. There is a particular quality of light inside an Ottoman coffeehouse. Imagine entering through a low doorway from the dark street, ducking your head slightly under the beam, feeling the warmth before you see the room, and then straightening up and finding yourself in a space about the size of a large living room, filled with perhaps 40 men seated on low cushions arranged around the walls and around the central hearth. The light is warm and uneven, oil lamps on the walls, a brazier glowing in the center, perhaps candles on small tables near the back. The ceiling is low. The air is thick with the smell of roasted coffee and charcoal and the wool of many coats drying in the warmth. This is the first coffee house in Istanbul. It is 1554, very recently opened, in the quarter of the city, down near the waterfront where the merchants from Syria and Egypt and the eastern trade routes tend to settle. Two men named and Shams have brought the practice from their homeland and set up a room where you can come, pay a small fee, sit on a cushion, and drink a small cup of the dark, bitter liquid that has begun arriving in the city along the spice trade routes. Coffee is new here. Some of the men in this room have never tasted anything like it before. They describe the sensation as alerting, clarifying, warming, a drink that sharpens the mind without the haze of wine, that keeps you awake and conversational without the disorder of alcohol. A drink entirely appropriate to a city governed by Islamic law, which prohibits wine. A drink, in other words, made for the coffee house. Because the coffee house offered something that Ottoman social life badly needed and had never quite had before. A space where men of ordinary and middling status could sit for hours in warmth and company without spending money on food or drink beyond a small cup. A space that was neither the mosque, which demanded silence and propriety, nor the home, which required you to have guests and feed them properly, and therefore to have money enough to do so. A space that was simply there, open, lit, warm, for whoever could afford one cup of coffee. For the wealthy merchant or the ranking official, there was no problem with entertaining at home. The prosperous household could spread its carpets and lay its cushions and serve its guests food and sherbet and sweets for an entire evening. And this was the proper way of receiving guests, and it demonstrated your status and your generosity. But for the young scribe who shared a room with two other men, or the junior guild apprentice, or the small-time spice merchant whose shop was barely profitable, these men had no room to receive guests, no household to display, no money to feed an evening's worth of visitors. The coffee house gave them somewhere to be. What happened inside was everything that happened when men with nothing to do except talk sat together in warmth. Chess was played. The boards were provided by the house. Backgammon dice clattered on low tables. Poetry was recited, sometimes by one man who had memorized a great deal of it and was willing to perform, sometimes passed around the room like a game, each man adding a line or commenting on the last. Stories were told, the professional storyteller, who would appear in the more established coffee houses a generation or two later, was perhaps not yet a regular fixture in 1554, but informal storytelling was practiced everywhere. And politics was discussed. Here is where the authorities grew nervous. A coffee house is, among other things, a place where people complain. They complain about the price of bread and the behavior of officials and the decisions made by those above them, and they do so in the company of other men who have similar complaints, and the complaints circulate and amplify and sometimes harden into positions and sometimes even into organization. The Ottoman administration was aware of this dynamic and was not comfortable with it. At various points in Ottoman history, not necessarily during its reign, but in the decades that followed, local authorities moved to suppress or regulate the coffee houses, sometimes citing Islamic legal arguments against the permissibility of coffee itself, sometimes simply citing the seditious quality of the conversations within. These campaigns were never entirely successful. The coffee houses were too useful, too popular, too deeply embedded in the social fabric of the city to be removed. They reopened after closures spread to new neighborhoods. By the mid-17th century, there were more than 600 of them in Istanbul. The authorities continued to be nervous. The men inside continued to play backgammon and recite poetry, and drink their bitter cups and talk. The lamp on the wall gutters in the draught from the door. A man in the corner finishes a story he has been telling for 20 minutes. There is appreciative murmuring. Someone requests another cup. Outside, the street is dark and nearly empty. Inside, in the warm and crowded room, the night is young. Chapter 6. The Wooden Houses of the City. Come away from the coffee house now, back into the street, and turn left, and walk up the hill into the residential neighborhood above the waterfront. The streets here are narrow. In some places, the upper floors of the houses on either side of the lane extend over the street until they are almost touching overhead, creating a kind of wooden tunnel through which you walk in a deeper darkness than the open street. The buildings are entirely of wood, timber-framed, often 2 or 3 stories, with the upper floors projecting further out than the lower ones. In the daytime, these streets are busy and noisy. At this hour, they are quiet, and the only light is what leaks through the shuttered windows, thin lines of yellow lamplight at the seams of the wooden shutters. Almost every house in Istanbul, outside the stone-built palace complex and the major mosques and a few of the wealthiest private residences, was built of wood. This is the first thing you need to understand about the domestic life of this city. It was a wooden city, and as a result, it was a city in constant danger of fire. Fires swept through Istanbul regularly throughout the Ottoman period, leveling whole neighborhoods, and the pattern of rebuilding in wood meant the danger was always renewed. But wood was cheap. It was abundant from the forests of the shores and the Black Sea coast, and it was flexible. Wooden buildings could be added to, modified, and expanded in ways that stone construction did not allow. An ordinary household on this hill might occupy a house with 2 or 3 rooms arranged around a small enclosed courtyard. The courtyard served as the workspace during the day. Laundry was hung there, food was prepared there, children played there. In warm months, the family might sleep in the courtyard under the stars, the night sky completely unobscured by the city's lights, the Milky Way visible in all its pale glory, the stars of navigators and poets and farmers. In winter and on cold nights, they were inside. Inside was simple. Ottoman interiors were not cluttered in the way that European interiors of the same period tended to be. There were no chairs and no tables of the European sort. You sat on the floor, on cushions, on the layered carpets that served both as warmth and as the primary furnishing. The carpets themselves were often among the most valuable objects a household owned. Even in a modest wooden house, the carpet on the floor might represent months of work, woven by the women of the household or purchased over years from the carpet sellers in the bazaar. Carpets were not decorative objects in the European sense. They were furniture, insulation, warmth, comfort, and when the prayer rug was unrolled from its storage corner, the dedicated sacred space of the household. There were no beds. This last point is worth pausing on because it is so different from what most of us are accustomed to. Ottoman bedding was stored during the day. Built into the walls of most rooms were large recessed cabinets, wooden doors set into the plaster, and inside these cabinets the sleeping mattresses were rolled up and stored, along with extra blankets and cushions and the folded cloth covers that served as sheets. Each evening, as the night came and the household prepared for sleep, the cabinet doors were opened and the mattresses were taken out and laid on the floor. Each morning, everything was rolled back up and stored away, and the floor of the room, covered with its carpets and cushions, became a living room, a dining room, a workspace. The mattresses were typically stuffed with wool or cotton, heavy enough to insulate from the cold of the floor, but thin enough to be rolled and stored. Wealthier households might have mattresses of finer wool, covered in better cloth, and additional quilts layered on top for cold nights. In very poor households, the sleeping surface might be nothing more than a doubled-over kaleem, a flat woven rug without pile laid directly on the floor. But the principle was the same across all economic levels. The bed was not a piece of furniture that sat in the room and defined it. The bed was something you brought out when you needed it and put away when you did not. This means that the room you are imagining right now, if you are picturing a family preparing for sleep in a one-room wooden house near the bazaar, was also the room they ate their supper in, the room the children did their lessons in, the room the mother and grandmother sewed in during the day. Everything happened in the same space. Privacy, in the European sense of separate rooms for separate activities, was not the organizing principle. Instead, the organization was temporal. The same space was different things at different times of day. There was beauty in this arrangement, though it is hard to see it at first from the outside. Because the room was not permanently defined by its furniture, it was always in transition, always being made and unmade. The same space held lightly, capable of accommodating whatever the day or the night required. The family that ate together on the same floor where they would soon sleep. The children whose mattresses were pulled out from the cabinet each night and tucked back each morning. They lived in a kind of intimate relationship with the physical space of their home that the European household, with its fixed furniture and defined rooms, did not quite replicate. In winter, a brazier burned in the corner. This was a metal vessel, often of copper, filled with burning charcoal. It produced warmth and a mild smoke and a faintly acrid smell. Wealthier households had built-in fireplaces with proper chimneys. Very poor households might burn only what they could afford, and in a bad winter, the difference between having fuel and not having it was not merely a matter of comfort. The cold of Istanbul could be severe. Snow fell across the rooftops several times each winter, and in extreme cold, partially froze over, and the wind that came off the Black Sea was a serious physical adversary for a poorly insulated wooden house with thin shutters and a fire that had gone out in the night. But on a mild October evening, let us say, with the first coolness of autumn, but not yet the severity of winter, the house is comfortable. The lamp burns on its hook on the wall, a small ceramic or metal vessel containing olive oil, with a wick of twisted linen floating in it, producing a small, warm, slightly unsteady flame. The children are asleep on their mattresses, their blankets pulled up to their chins, their breath coming slow and regular in the lamplight. The adults are still awake. There is sewing to be done, or a husband and wife talking quietly in the lamplight, or simply the pleasure of sitting still in a warm room after a long day. The sounds of the neighborhood come through the shutters. The tap of the staff, distant and regular, marking his progress through the streets below. The distant sound of a dog barking in the next street and then going quiet. The creak of the wooden house as it settles in the cooling air of the night, the timber contracting slightly as the warmth of the day leaves it, This sound, so familiar in old wooden buildings, is especially pronounced here where the walls are thin and the wood is green and still moving. A cat Istanbul has always had cats, beloved and semi-feral, belonging to everyone, and no one pads softly across the courtyard below, its claws clicking faintly on the stone. The mother reaches up and turns down the wick of the lamp. The flame diminishes to a point, gutters, and goes out. In the sudden darkness, the room is warm and smells of wood smoke and wool and the last traces of the evening meal. The children breathe. The adults settle. The night takes the room. Outside, the passes, his lantern swinging, his staff tapping the cobblestones. He does not know who is sleeping inside these walls. He does not need to. His job is to walk the street and keep watch over all of them at once. The sleeping city his responsibility, his rounds the last human thing between the household and the dark. Chapter 7: The After Dark. But not all of the city is asleep at this hour. On the next street over, set into the side of the hill, with its low stone dome rising above the roofline of the wooden houses around it, is still lit. The bathhouse, the institution that served, for women in Ottoman Istanbul, many of the same social functions that the coffeehouse served for men. In 16th century Istanbul was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Almost no residential building, outside the very wealthiest, had any dedicated bathing space. There was no indoor plumbing in the European sense. Water came from the city's network of Roman and Byzantine aqueducts, which the Ottomans maintained and extended, delivered to public fountains and to wash properly, and Islam placed a high value on ritual cleanliness, requiring full body washing after certain bodily states, and before prayer, you went to the Istanbul in the 16th century had many dozens of them, of varying sizes, distributed across the neighborhoods of the city. The great imperial commissioned by and his architect were architectural masterpieces, domed stone structures with a careful organization of hot and cold rooms, their walls clad in marble, their surfaces designed to channel and distribute heat with precision. But the neighborhood serving a residential quarter was more modest, a practical building, stone-domed to retain heat, with the basic equipment of hot water and a fire beneath the floor, functional rather than grand, used by the same people every week. They were separate for men and women, or the same operated on a time-sharing basis, men in the morning and evening, women during the day. Some, particularly the larger and more prosperous ones, stayed open well into the night for men, and had extended women's hours in the afternoon that stretched toward early evening. A woman going to the was not simply going to wash. She was going out, one of the few occasions when she had legitimate and socially accepted reason to leave the home and spend several hours in the company of other women without the supervision of male household members. There was where women gathered and talked, and where important social functions were performed. A bride's ritual bathing before her wedding, performed with ceremony and songs among the women of both families. The introduction of a new bride to her husband's neighborhood, the observation of a new baby's first bath at 40 days, the gathering of mothers discussing their children and husbands and in-laws with the frank energy of women who have been cooped up at home for too long. And coffee was served at the. This is worth noting. Even before the coffee houses spread through the city's neighborhoods, and became the social institution they would be for men, coffee was finding its way into the social world of women through the dressing room. Women brought their own supplies, dried fruit, sweets, small dishes of food, and spread these on cloth in the outer room, though while they rested after washing, wrapped in dry linen towels and drinking cups of the dark, bitter liquid while they talked. The visit could last several hours. This was time that belonged to women, genuinely and completely, one of the few such times in the organized structure of Ottoman urban life. Imagine entering you pass through the outer room, where you undress and leave your clothing and shoes, wrapping yourself in a large square of woven linen. You pay a small fee to the attendant at the door. She gives you wooden sandals with raised platform soles to keep your feet above the wet stone floor, and you click your way through the anteroom and into the warm room, where the air already carries moisture and the smell of soap, and then through the final door into the heat itself. The interior of is a world of low stone arches and steam. The central hall, the hot room, is dominated by the navel stone, a large raised marble platform in the center of the room that radiates warmth from below, heated by the fire in the furnace room underneath the floor. Women lie on this stone, wrapped in their linen cloths, letting the heat work into their muscles and joints, feeling the accumulated aches of the week soften and release under the warmth of the stone. Some lie still, eyes closed, in a state that is not quite sleep and not quite wakefulness, something between, something that only the produces, a kind of horizontal surrender to warmth. In the arched alcoves around the perimeter, private washing basins, there are set into the marble walls. Here you mix hot water from the brass tap and cold water from the cold tap into the marble bowl, and pour it over yourself with a small copper cup, over and over, the water temperature exactly calibrated to your preference. The rhythm of the pouring and the warmth combining into a physical pleasure that is entirely simple and entirely complete. The attendants, the women who worked employed by the owner, provided the service of the scrubbing of the skin with a coarseweave mitt, called that removed the accumulated dead skin and left the body feeling scoured and new, as if a layer of the world had been removed along with the dead skin. This scrubbing was followed by soap, Aleppo soap, typically the hard soap from Syria made of olive oil and laurel oil in varying proportions, greenish-black on the outside and green within, considered one of the finest soaps in the Mediterranean world. The smell of was its own world, water and heated marble and wet linen and soap, and the faint mineral smell of the stone, and underneath all of it, the very faint trace of wood smoke from the furnace somewhere beneath the floor, the fire that kept all of this warmth alive. Women who could afford to came regularly, some wealthy women came daily. A middle-class woman might come once or twice a week. For the very poor, entry was possible because most had a sliding scale or allowed the destitute to use the steam room for free in exchange for small services, carrying water, cleaning the basins. As the night deepened and the women's hour ended, and the attendants began to close the outer doors and call for the departure of the last bathers, the heat slowly dissipated, the furnace banked for the night, the steam thinning in the stone rooms, the marble growing cooler. The attendants swept the wet floors, folded the used linen towels, banked the furnace for the night. By the time the city was truly asleep, it was dark and cool and waiting for morning, holding the day's accumulated warmth inside its stone walls, releasing it slowly into the cold night air above the dome. Chapter 8: Light and Darkness in the Streets. Step outside again, let your eyes adjust. In the absence of light, they adjust. It takes several minutes, 5, 10, 15. But gradually the darkness reveals itself as not entirely uniform. There is the light of the moon when the moon is present. In a city with no electric illumination, the full moon on a clear night was genuinely useful, casting shadows and making shapes legible. And the rhythms of the Islamic lunar calendar meant that the city's inhabitants paid close attention to the state of the moon. Moonlit nights were safer, more navigable. Moonless nights, particularly in winter, were as dark as the interior of a cave. Above the rooftops, on clear nights, the stars are remarkable. Without the orange wash of electric light that has swallowed the night sky of every modern city, the sky above 16th century Istanbul was dark in the way that people who grew up before electrification remember it, the Milky Way visible as a pale smear across the darkness, individual stars sharp as points of light struck from flint. For a city that navigated by the lunar calendar and oriented itself toward Mecca 5 times a day, the stars were not merely beautiful, they were functional. But in the street, at ground level, the darkness was more pressing. The streets of Ottoman Istanbul were not lit by public lamps. There was no system of municipal street lighting. That innovation would not arrive in the city until the 19th century with the installation of gas lamps. The light in the streets at night came from 4 sources. First, the lanterns of people walking. Anyone with legitimate business in the streets at night was supposed to carry one by law. A servant holding a lantern ahead of his master, the lantern swinging in the servant's hand and casting its small moving circle of yellow light on the cobblestones. A merchant hurrying home late, his own lantern in his hand. Second, the light leaking from buildings. From a warm glow under the door. From the coffeehouse, lamplight through the cracks around the shutters. From the residential street, the thin bright lines at the edges of wooden shutters, marking where a family was still awake inside. Third, the lamps at the mosque gates. The mosques maintained lamps at their entrances as acts of piety to light the way of those coming to prayer. The larger mosques had multiple lanterns hung from their portico arches, creating small islands of public light in the darkness. These were the gathering points on dark nights. You navigated toward the mosque lamp and then picked your route from there. Fourth, on certain sacred occasions, especially during Ramadan, the mosques were specifically illuminated with additional lamps along their domes and minarets, creating a spectacle of light that was visible from miles away, the city announcing itself to the night. For those without lanterns, and there were many in a city of hundreds of thousands, the nighttime street was navigated by hearing as much as by sight. You listened for the staff to know where the watchman was. You listened for the sound of the fountain to know you were near the neighborhood water source. You felt the change in texture under your feet, the larger cobblestones of the main street, the rough earth of the unpaved alley, the worn smooth stone of the mosque courtyard. You pressed one hand along the wall and counted doorways, and you were nervous because the dark street was genuinely uncertain. Crime in Ottoman Istanbul was real. though its scale is difficult to assess from the surviving records. There were thieves. The city had an organized underworld of professional criminals, pickpockets, and burglars, and the network of guild-based associations that organized legitimate trade also had its mirror in the associations that organized illegitimate activities. At night, when the streets were empty and they were not everywhere at once, a lone figure with a visible lantern was a target as much as a protection. The attitude of the law toward victims of night crime was not always sympathetic. If you were found beaten in the street without a lantern, it was assumed you had been up to something. Why else were you out in the dark without a light? The lantern was not just a practical object. It was a statement of innocence. And its absence was not just inconvenient. It was a presumption of guilt. The darkness of the Ottoman night was not neutral. It had a moral character. It belonged, officially, to prayer and to rest. Those who used it for other purposes did so in its shadow, which is to say, in the knowledge that the darkness that concealed them was also the darkness that condemned them. Chapter 9. The Grand Bazaar sealed for the night. From the top of the hill, looking down toward the center of the old city, you can see where the Grand Bazaar stands. You cannot see the bazaar itself in the darkness. Its low, dome-covered roofline blends into the surrounding buildings, but you can sense its presence by the way the streets around it are organized, converging from all directions toward those great wooden gates. The gates are shut. The covered bazaar, the Grand Bazaar, is perhaps the most extraordinary market in the world at this moment in history. It grew from a simple market structure built by II after the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, and it has been expanding ever since, absorbing neighboring hands, the caravanserais where merchants stored and traded their goods, and adding streets and galleries until it is now a self-contained city within the city, a labyrinth of covered lanes running for dozens of streets in every direction under its vaulted stone and brick ceilings. Inside it during the day, silk from China and Bursa, spices from the Indian Ocean trade, copper and brass vessels from the metalworkers of Anatolia, fine woolen cloth from the workshops of Istanbul and the Balkans, jewels and gold from the mines of the empire, and from the trade routes that ran through it. Every kind of thing that human ingenuity has produced and trade has distributed gathers here, in the covered lanes, in the locked cabinets, and displayed shelves of thousands of shops. The shopkeepers are guilds, tightly organized associations of merchants practicing the same trade, governed by their own rules, their own arbitration procedures, their own standards of quality and weight. Each guild occupied its own section of the bazaar, so the jewelers were in one lane, the carpet dealers in another, the silk merchants in a third. You could navigate the bazaar by smell and sound as much as by sight. The spice section reached you from 20 meters away, and the hammering from the metalworkers' quarter was audible from the entrance. At dusk, all of this was locked away. The guild officials responsible for each section of the bazaar performed the closing in sequence, each gate pulled shut, each bolt driven home, each padlock latched. The process took time. There were many gates, and they were heavy, and the iron bolts were stiff from the day's warmth and the approaching coolness of the evening. But eventually, as full dark settled over the city and the sounded from the minarets above, The last gate was locked, and the great bazaar was sealed for the night. And then the soldiers went in. More than 100 soldiers, janissaries, most likely, drawn from the garrison that maintained order in this district, took up their posts inside the bazaar and began their nighttime patrols. They walked the empty lanes with their lanterns, checking the shop doors, verifying that nothing had been disturbed, watching for any sign of a fire. Fire inside the bazaar was a catastrophic and recurring fear. A fire in a covered structure full of textiles and wooden shelving could destroy the whole complex in hours. They would walk these empty lanes all night, their footsteps echoing in the stone corridors, the lantern light moving through the darkness like a slow orange fish through dark water. The only way to enter the Grand Bazaar after its gates were locked was by imperial order. An edict from the palace, countersigned by the appropriate officials, specifying the purpose and the persons authorized to enter. This level of bureaucratic formality for after-hours market access tells you something about how seriously the Ottoman administration took the protection of its commercial heart. The goods inside were not merely private property. They were the blood of the empire's economy, the material that funded the janissaries and the fleet, and the palace kitchens and the mosques and the hospitals and the roads. The Grand Bazaar was sealed at night with the same seriousness that the army sealed a captured fort. Outside its walls, the streets that led to it were empty. A cat picked its way along the base of the bazaar wall, pressing its nose to the crack under one of the gates, smelling the spice and silk and darkness beyond. The soldiers inside heard nothing. They walked their rounds, lantern in hand, and the lanes of the bazaar curved away ahead of them in the darkness, silent and full of treasure. Chapter 10: Supper in the City. By now, in most households, the evening meal has been eaten. Supper in Ottoman Istanbul was not a late affair. The pattern of the day, organized around the 5 prayers, meant that the evening meal came after the sunset prayer, while there was still some warmth in the evening air and before the household settled towards sleep. The prayer that follows, the night prayer we began with, often came after the meal, not before it. What was on the table? Or rather, there was no table in most homes, so let us ask it differently. What was laid on the cloth that was spread on the carpet of the main room for the evening meal? For an ordinary middle-class household near the bazaar, the evening meal was likely centered on. This is the word Ottomans used for what we call pilaf, rice or wheat cooked in broth with butter, the grain absorbing the liquid until each piece was separate and fragrant and faintly translucent. Rice was eaten in the city, though it was expensive, was more common in the households of ordinary people. To the might be added stewed meat, lamb or chicken, the most common meats in Ottoman cuisine, cooked down to tenderness in a pot with onions and occasionally spices, though the heavy spicing of meat was more a palace fashion than an ordinary household practice. Bread was present at every meal and might be more important than anything else on the cloth. The flatbreads of Ottoman Istanbul, lavash, a variety of simple unleavened or lightly leavened breads baked in the neighborhood, the communal ovens that served the residential districts, were central to the diet of the city. You tore them and dipped them in whatever was on the cloth, or simply held them and ate them plain. The city's bread bakers worked through the night so that fresh bread would be available at dawn, and the smell of baking bread in the hours before sunrise was part of the fabric of the city's nights. Yogurt, made from sheep or goat milk, appeared frequently, either eaten plain with a drizzle of clarified butter or used as a sauce over, or thinned with water and salted into the cooling drink cold. Legumes, chickpeas, lentils, dried beans were the protein of the poor, slow-cooked in clay pots that could be set over a low fire for hours while the household went about its day. To finish the meal, there might be a compote made from dried fruits, usually apricots, figs, or raisins, simmered in water with a little sugar or honey until the liquid was faintly sweet and amber-colored, and the fruits were swollen and soft. By the 17th century, dozens of shops in Istanbul specialized in nothing, but in time it was still primarily a household preparation. But the pleasure of it, something sweet and gentle to close the meal, to ease the transition from eating into rest, was universal. Now consider the palace kitchens. These were located in the second courtyard of palace, a series of interconnected kitchen buildings with tall chimney stacks that vented the smoke from dozens of fires. Under the Magnificent, the palace kitchen employed approximately 500 people. By the end of the century, the number exceeded 1,000. These were not all cooks. They included pastry makers, syrup makers, confectioners, makers, the men who made the Sultan's yogurt, and the men who managed the ice stored in the palace's ice cellars, packed in winter from the mountains, and kept through the summer for cooling drinks and preserving food. The palace kitchens produced hundreds of dishes, a level of culinary variety and ambition that had no equal in the city or arguably in the world at that time. But what exactly was prepared, in what combinations, and by what methods, was deliberately kept secret. The cooks of the palace kitchens were forbidden to write down their recipes. The knowledge was oral, passed from master to apprentice in the kitchen itself, deliberately kept from leaving the palace walls. This secrecy was partly security. The fear of poisoning was real and constant in the Ottoman court, and controlling the knowledge of what went into the Sultan's food was one layer of that protection and partly prestige. The Sultan's table was meant to be inimitable. No one outside the palace should be able to replicate it. On ordinary streets, as the evening settled and the shops closed, the vendors who had worked the streets during the day were packing up. The bread seller would be going back to the bakery. The shop would be closing its shutters. The chickpea seller with his portable brazier would be heading home. By full dark, the food economy of the open street was done for the night. Inside the wooden houses, the cloth was folded, the bowls were carried to the courtyard to be washed. The remaining bread was covered with a cloth. The lamp burned low. The brazier settled. The family arranged itself for the night. Chapter 11: The Harem at Night. Let us cross to the other side of the hill, past the great gate of the first courtyard of palace, past the guards who stand there in their tall white ceremonial helmets with the black feathers, past the gate of the second courtyard, where the kitchen chimney stacks rise in a line against the dark sky, and approach the section of the palace that lies furthest to the interior, the harem. The word harem comes from the Arabic haram, forbidden, sacred, inviolable. It did not originally mean what it has come to mean in the European imagination, which is to say a seraglio, a place of captive women kept for a ruler's pleasure. The harem was something both more ordinary and more complex than that fantasy. It was the domestic quarter of the palace, the private household of the Sultan and his family, a world that was forbidden to outsiders, male outsiders, specifically not because it was shameful, but because it was private. The domestic life of a family, in Ottoman understanding, was sacred and not for display. What the harem actually was at its height was a very large and very elaborately organized household. It contained more than 400 rooms by the time it reached its full extent in the 17th century. In time it was somewhat smaller, still growing, having been recently moved from the old palace in the city to its present location at. There were dormitories for the junior concubines and servants, long corridors with arched ceilings and sleeping spaces arranged in rows along the walls. There were private apartments for the women of higher rank. There were baths, a mosque, a school, a hospital, gardens, and courtyards. The women inside the harem were not all concubines. The majority were servants of various kinds, women who cooked and cleaned and sewed and carried and organized the daily functioning of the household. There were eunuchs, male servants castrated before puberty, who served as intermediaries between the harem and the outside world, carrying messages, escorting women when they needed to move through the palace, maintaining the physical security of the harem's doors. Above the servants were the concubines, women who had been brought to the palace and educated in Ottoman courtly culture, trained in music and poetry and needlework and the arts of conversation. The hierarchy within the harem was elaborate and strictly maintained. At its apex was not the sultan, but the sultan's mother. The queen mother held the highest authority within the domestic world of the palace, outranking the sultan's wives and all the concubines. She had her own suite of rooms, her own servants, her own income from the imperial treasury, and her own political influence, which could be and often was considerable. The relationship between a sultan and his mother was the most important relationship in the harem, more foundational to its daily functioning than the relationship between the sultan and any of his wives or concubines. In time, the harem contained one woman of exceptional and historically unusual status. Sultan, the woman the Europeans called. She had come to the palace as a concubine, likely from somewhere in the Slavic lands of Eastern Europe, though her exact origins are debated. She bore the Sultan several children, which elevated her status considerably, and then, around 1533 or 1534, did something that astonished the court and scandalized the diplomatic community of Europe. He married her, legally. A ceremony, a contract, a change in formal status. Sultans did not marry their concubines. It simply was not done. And yet did it, and Sultan moved from the old palace, where concubines usually lived, to itself, living in new chambers constructed specifically for her. What her nights were like inside those chambers, we can only partially imagine. She was educated by all accounts. She wrote poetry in Turkish and corresponded with in letters that survive, playful and affectionate, and sometimes politically pointed. She had real power inside the palace, and some real influence outside it, channeled through her relationship with the Sultan. She also had enemies, many enemies, among those who resented her unusual position and feared her influence. At night, the harem doors were locked. The eunuchs who guarded the entrances were the only men permitted inside. The women arranged themselves for sleep, the junior concubines and servants on their mattresses in the long dormitory rooms, the senior women in their private quarters. The sounds of the night in the harem were the sounds of the palace itself. The distant sound of the through-latticed windows, the footsteps of eunuchs in the corridors, occasionally the sound of a child crying and being soothed. There is a detail from historical accounts of the Ottoman palace that is strange enough to stay with you. Concubines selected for the palace were, by some accounts, observed for a period of 24 hours before their purchase was confirmed. Among the qualities assessed, in addition to beauty and health and intelligence, was their sleeping behavior. Heavy snoring or sleeping in an unseemly way could reportedly reduce the price offered. Sleep, the most private and involuntary of human activities, was judged, evaluated, priced. What this tells us about the harem is something useful. Even in sleep, nothing inside that world was truly private. The gaze was always present. The hierarchy was always operative. Even in the dark, behind locked doors, the social order of the world's most powerful court extended its reach into the most personal hours of the night. Chapter 12. The Dervishes' Spin. There is a building on a street in the neighborhood, across the Golden Horn from the old city, where the lights are still burning at this hour. The building has a distinctive silhouette, a round dance hall with a wooden interior balcony running around its perimeter and a polished wooden floor in the center. There is a small minaret attached to the complex, and the sound of a reed flute that drifts faintly into the street outside. This is the house, of the order in Istanbul. And inside, something is happening that has been happening regularly in this building and in many others across the Ottoman Empire since the order was founded by the followers of ad-Din Muhammad in 13th century Konya. The is often described, in the language of tourism, as the whirling dervish ceremony. This description is accurate in its facts and misleading in its framing. Yes, men in white robes are spinning. Yes, they are dervishes. The word simply means a member of a Sufi order, a Muslim mystic who has committed to a path of devotional practice. But the is not a ceremony in the sense of a performance staged for observers. It is a form of prayer. The men who spin in the are not performing for an audience. They are addressing God. The turning, slow at first, accelerating, maintained for long periods until it approaches the continuous. The self-sustaining, the hypnotic, is understood within the tradition as a form of surrender. You turn, and the turning empties you. The self, the ego, the chattering voice, the accumulation of grievances and ambitions and anxieties that fills most of a person's waking consciousness, recedes as the turning continues, and what remains in the center of the spinning is something that the tradition would call nearness to God, and what a non-believer might call a state of pure presence, in which the boundary between the self and the surrounding world has temporarily dissolved. The music that accompanies the is among the most complex and carefully developed sacred music in the Islamic world. The end-blown reed flute, made from a hollow cane, producing a breathy, intimate sound that's own poetry associated with the cry of the soul separated from its divine origin, leads the ensemble. With it, the small paired drums played with thin sticks, the small cymbals, and sometimes the rebab, a bowed string instrument. The combination produces a texture that is somehow both sparse and complete, like the night sky with just enough stars. The sheikh, the spiritual master of the head of the local community, does not spin. He stands or sits at the center of the still point around which the dervishes orbit, and he observes and guides. That has a prescribed structure, a series of or salutations, each at a different tempo and with different movement qualities. It is not improvised. It is transmitted, learned, practiced, a form that has been refined over centuries. For a city governed by Ottoman Islamic law, the order occupied an unusual position. Sufism, the mystical dimension of Islam, was not separate from mainstream Islamic practice in the Ottoman context. The sultans patronized the Sufi orders. Himself visited the lodge at Konya. The house had been established in Istanbul in the late 15th century and was patronized by sultans and prominent officials. And yet Sufism, with its emphasis on direct personal experience of the divine, its music, its ecstatic practices, its saints and their tombs and their miracles, existed in a constant negotiation with the more strictly law-minded elements of Islamic scholarship. The tension was managed in the Ottoman context by the sheer prestige of the orders and their history of political loyalty, but it was always present. What is certain is that on this night, in the candlelit of the house, men in white robes are turning. Their arms are extended, right palm facing upward toward heaven, left palm facing downward toward the earth. They receive what comes from above and pass it to the world below. They are the channel, the plays, the taps. The floor is smooth under the felt shoes of the dervishes. The white robes bell outward with the force of the turning. The candles burn steady in the still air of the outside. The street is dark. The city sleeps, or nearly sleeps. And here, in this room, men turn in the darkness and pray. Chapter 13. Christian and Jewish Quarters After Dark. Cross back over the Golden Horn, but this time stay in rather than climbing up toward the old city. Walk through the narrow streets of this neighborhood, which has a different character from the quarters within the old walls. Was, in the 16th century, a district of great ethnic and religious diversity. It had been a Genoese trading colony before the Ottoman conquest, and many of the families that had lived under Genoese rule had simply remained. Their distinctive stone tower, the tower, still dominated the neighborhood's skyline, having been incorporated into the Ottoman city as a lighthouse and observation post. The streets of were home to Genoese and other Italian merchants, to Greek Orthodox Christians who had been here since before the conquest, to Armenians, to Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews who had arrived in great numbers following their expulsion from Spain in 1492, and to various other communities of traders and craftspeople from across the Mediterranean and beyond. The Jewish community of Istanbul deserves particular attention because by the early 16th century it had grown remarkably. Following the Spanish expulsion of 1492, Sultan I's grandfather famously welcomed the Jewish refugees to the Ottoman Empire, reportedly saying of the Spanish king who expelled them that he was impoverishing Spain and enriching the Ottomans. The Jews who came brought with them skills in medicine, finance, and trade that the Ottoman economy genuinely valued. By the early decades of the 16th century, the Jewish population of Istanbul had reached approximately 20,000. By the end of the century, Jews accounted for roughly 60% of licensed physicians in the city, a remarkable concentration of medical expertise in a single community. The Jewish and Greek Christian neighborhoods of Istanbul and had their own nighttime rhythms, parallel to but distinct from the Muslim majorities. The synagogues and churches observed their own sacred calendars. The Jewish Shabbat, the Sabbath, beginning at sunset on Friday and ending at nightfall Saturday, was a weekly transformation of the Jewish quarters. Lamps were lit in homes before sunset on Friday and burned through the night. Meals were prepared in advance. The normal rhythms of commerce ceased and were replaced by the rhythms of prayer, study, rest, and family gathering. The Shabbat candles in a Jewish household were more than ritual objects. They were the physical embodiment of the obligation to rest, to step outside the world of work and commerce, and let the night be what it was. The Greek Orthodox communities had their own saints' days, their own feast days, their own all-night services that brought the congregation to their churches in the deepest hours of the night for liturgies chanted in Byzantine Greek that had not substantially changed in centuries. The smell of incense and beeswax candles, the low chant of the priest, the gold of the iconostasis gleaming in the candlelight, this was a parallel sensory world to the Ottoman Islamic city around it, running in the same space at the same time, mostly invisible to the Muslim majority. They were also in taverns. Ottoman law prohibited the manufacture and sale of wine to Muslims, but it did not generally prohibit non-Muslims from operating establishments where wine was served. The taverns run by Greek and Armenian and Jewish proprietors, patronized openly by Christian and Jewish residents, and, according to various accounts, discreetly by some Muslim residents as well, were among the few nighttime establishments that remained open and lit and noisy in the later hours of the night. The authorities viewed these establishments with the ambivalence that characterized much of Ottoman policy toward non-Muslim religious practice, officially tolerated within the framework of the system, which guaranteed the rights of non-Muslim communities to practice their religion and maintain their institutions in exchange for paying the tax, unofficially observed with suspicion, and subjected to periodic crackdowns when a particular official felt particularly zealous or particularly poorly disposed toward the community in question. But for most of the nights of most of the years of reign, the taverns were simply there. A different kind of lamplight in a different kind of room. A different smell, grape and wood, and the particular warmth of a crowd that has been drinking. A different sound, song, occasionally, the Greek or Armenian melodies that belonged to a different musical tradition than the Ottoman classical modes, carrying out into the street and mingling with the sound of the water and the distant call of a nightbird over the dark water of the Golden Horn. The city contained all of this at once. That was what made it the city it was. Chapter 14: The Sultan's Night. Let us now climb to the highest point of the old city, to the cape where thee and the Golden Horn meet, and pass through the great gate into the first courtyard of palace. The palace, though calling it a palace slightly misrepresents it, was more like a series of pavilions and courtyards arranged according to a careful logic of increasing privacy and decreasing access. The outermost courtyard was semi-public during the day, accessible to any petitioner who came to seek justice or favor. The second courtyard, where the palace kitchens and the janissary barracks were located, was more restricted. The third courtyard, the inner court, was accessible only to the highest officials and to the palace's own educated servants. Beyond that lay the harem, accessible to almost no one. At night, the concentric rings of restriction tightened further. Guards took up their posts at every gate. The courtyards, which during the day were full of movement and business, became still. The sound of the water moving ceaselessly around the cape on which the palace stands was suddenly audible, freed from the noise of the day. Himself, Caliph of Islam, Sultan of the Ottomans, sovereign of the two continents and the two seas, servant of the two holy sanctuaries, was at this hour in his private apartments in the third courtyard, or more likely, in the rooms he had constructed for himself and in the harem section. What was his night like? We have imperfect but real evidence. He was a man of notable intellectual seriousness. He wrote poetry, serious poetry, in the classical Ottoman mode, under the pen name meaning the loving one. He was interested in architecture and commissioned the greatest architect of the Ottoman Empire to build his mosque complex, his bridges, his hands, his complexes of pious endowments across the empire. He was interested in law. The title his subjects gave him, the lawgiver, reflected his extensive codification of Ottoman legal practice. He was also a man living at the center of one of the most politically dangerous positions in the world. Ottoman succession was not governed by primogeniture. The eldest son did not automatically inherit the throne. Instead, when a sultan died, his sons competed, and the winner typically had his brothers executed to prevent future challenges. This system produced sultans who were highly capable, natural selection, operating through political survival. But it also produced a court in which everyone, including the sultan's own sons, was a potential threat. The paranoia this created was not irrational. It was appropriate to the environment. The night, was also the time of private correspondence and private thought. He wrote letters to that have survived, letters expressing affection, concern, missing her when he was away on campaign, complaining of loneliness. These letters, read alongside the formal records of his reign, reveal a man capable of genuine tenderness alongside his political ruthlessness, which makes him neither more nor less than what very powerful people tend to be: complicated. His bedroom, if we can call it that, would have been decorated with the tiles that are synonymous with Ottoman aesthetic achievement at this period. White ceramic tiles painted in cobalt blue and turquoise, and a distinctive tomato red with designs of flowers, arabesques, and calligraphy. The patterns are dense, but never chaotic. They have the quality of organized infinity, like looking through a window into a garden that has been thought about for a very long time. The lamp in the room would be a copper hanging lamp, oil burning, its light warm and yellow and casting the tile patterns into relief. The mattress would be covered in fine cloth. The sounds through the latticed windows, the guard's footsteps, the distant call of the muezzin, if the hour was late enough for the prayer or early enough for did sleep easily? We do not know. The historical record does not reach that far into private experience. What we know is that he campaigned continuously, 13 major military campaigns over his 46-year reign, and that the years of his later sultanate were darkened by the execution of his eldest son, ordered by himself in 1553, and by the growing influence of factions within the court that he could not fully control. Greatness, in the 16th century Ottoman sense, was a demanding and isolating condition. The sounds of the palace at night were the sounds of watching. Footsteps of guards, the creak of a gate, the distant breath of the Sultan lay in the darkness of his tiled room and was the most powerful person in the world and was watched over and had nothing to do until morning. Chapter 15: The Sounds of the Night. Let us rest for a moment and simply listen. Istanbul, at the height of its reign, was a city of extraordinary and layered sound, not just during the day, but at night. Even in the quiet hours, when most of the city was asleep, the sonic landscape of this city was richer than the silence of any modern city you might know. Begin with what was always present: the water. Istanbul is surrounded by water on three sides: the Golden Horn to the north, the to the east, the Sea of to the south, and the sound of moving water was the permanent bass note of the city's sonic existence. The in particular, a narrow and fast-moving strait connecting the Black Sea to the, had the particular rushing quality of water that is going somewhere quickly, and this sound was audible from the heights of the old city on still nights, a low continuous murmur of passage. Then, the animals. Istanbul was and famously remains a city of cats. In the Ottoman period, they were present everywhere: in the markets, in the mosque courtyards, where they were tolerated and fed as a sign of religious merit, in the residential streets, on the rooftops. At night, the cats conducted their social lives with no particular concern for human sleep schedules. Their calls, the territorial yowls, the mating screams, the ordinary conversational mewing of a cat that wants something from another cat, carried through the dark streets with perfect clarity. Dogs, kept by some households and numerous as strays, barked at thee as he passed, or at each other across the silence of the empty streets. Then, the describes the palace, the military band barracks, as housing 300 musicians in time. This is, like most of numbers, probably an exaggeration of the precise figure, but the scale of the institution was real. There was the Ottoman military band, the model from which European military bands eventually developed, brought to European attention when Ottoman armies marched into Central Europe, and Europeans heard for the first time what a military band at full scale actually sounded like. The instruments, the large double-headed bass drum struck with a curved stick on one side and a thin switch on the other, the enormous kettle drums of almost orchestral scale carried on horseback, a loud and penetrating double-reed instrument ancestral to the European oboe but much louder, a long metal trumpet without valves, the large cymbals, a crescent-shaped percussion instrument hung with bells and struck against the ground as the band marched. They played 3 times a day in Istanbul, at noon, in the afternoon, and in the evening after the nightfall prayer. From towers, the tower, where a tower watch was stationed, and various other elevated points around the city, the music of the carried across the rooftops and down through the streets with a force that was impossible to ignore. There was also the sound of prayer. Not just though they was the most structured and regular of the prayer sounds, but the sound of individual prayer from open windows and courtyards, the murmured and the quiet recitation of verses that was simply part of the ambient sound of a Muslim city. And from the Sufi orders, the sounds of collective dhikr, the repetitive chanting of divine names and phrases that was a central practice of the mystical orders, sometimes quiet, sometimes rising to an intensity that was audible in the street. And finally, underlying all of it, the city's own night sounds, the creak of a wooden house settling in the night air, the distant sound of a smith, if any worked late, the clang of hammer on iron, faint and rhythmic. The splash of a rat entering the water from the harbor wall, the call of the night heron from somewhere over the water, and then the moments between, the gaps in the sound growing longer as the night deepened, the interval between one dog's bark and the next, the pause after the staff tap before the next footfall. These gaps were not silence, they were the city breathing. The city that contained 300,000 separate sleeping consciousnesses, 300,000 private dreams, 300,000 quiet exhalations in dark rooms, had its own collective respiration, and in the deep hours of the night you could almost feel it. Not the absolute silence of the empty countryside. Istanbul was never truly silent, but the relative silence of a very large city in the deep hours of the night, when most of its hundreds of thousands of inhabitants had finally closed their eyes and let the sounds of the city wash over them like water and sunk into sleep. A sleep that was not the isolated, privacy-sealed, headphones and white noise sleep of a modern person in a modern apartment, but the sleep of someone embedded in a community, a neighborhood, a web of human lives, able to hear, even through shuttered windows, the footsteps, the cat's cry, the distant water. Not alone in the dark, but accompanied by the sounds of a shared world. Chapter 16: Ramadan Nights. Everything we have described so far belongs to an ordinary night in the year. But there is one period of the year in Ottoman Istanbul when the night becomes something entirely different. Ramadan. The 9th month of the Islamic lunar calendar, the month of fasting, changes the relationship of the entire city to the daily cycle of light and dark. During Ramadan, the faithful do not eat or drink from the first light of dawn until the sunset prayer, a period that in the summer months can extend to 15 or 16 hours. What this means, practically, is that the night becomes the time of eating and sociality and relief and celebration, and the day becomes the time of endurance and spiritual attention. The city's rhythm inverts. By the time darkness falls and the cannon shot that announces the end of the fast echoes from the palace walls across the city, this is the iftar, the breaking of the fast. The streets that have been quiet and subdued during the fasting hours suddenly fill with movement and life. Families gather around their cloths for the iftar meal, beginning with dates and water in the tradition of the Prophet, then moving through the courses of whatever they have been able to prepare or afford. The evening prayers are performed. And then, rather than settling towards sleep, as on an ordinary night, the city stays awake. The streets of Istanbul during Ramadan evenings were described by travelers and chroniclers as transformed. The markets that closed at dusk on ordinary nights extended their hours. Special Ramadan confectioners set up stalls, the sticky sweet pastries of the Ottoman dessert tradition, drenched in syrup and scattered with pistachios, the sherbet sellers with their cold drinks cooled by ice brought down from the mountains. Storytellers gathered crowds in the open spaces near the mosques. Tumblers and musicians performed in the streets. The coffee houses were packed. The mosques were brilliantly lit. During Ramadan, the minarets of the larger mosques were strung with lanterns. Small oil lamps hung on ropes between the minarets, creating patterns of light against the dark sky. The tradition, the spelling out of words and phrases in these lantern lights, is mentioned in Ottoman sources, though the precise dating of its origin is uncertain. Messages like welcome, O blessed month, or patience, or gratitude appeared spelled out in lights between the minarets, visible from distant parts of the city, a declaration in fire of the month's significance. Inside the mosques, the prayers, special additional prayers performed only during Ramadan, brought large congregations out in the evening for long prayer services that could extend for an hour or more. The sound of the congregation's collective movement, the rising and prostrating of many hundreds of people at once, the murmur of the imam's recitation, carried out through the mosque's open doors into the courtyard and the street beyond. And then, in the deepest hours of the night, when the Ramadan festivities had wound down and most of the city was asleep, the transformed into his Ramadan role. He came through the street with his drum, in the hour before dawn, in the last dark before the prayer signaled the beginning of the day's fast. He beat the drum with a steady, insistent rhythm, and he walked slowly through the residential streets of his neighborhood, calling out his poems in a voice loud enough to penetrate wooden shutters and reach sleeping ears. The poems varied, each had his own repertoire, and talented poetic performers were valued and remembered. But their purpose was the same: to wake the household in time for the sahur meal, the pre-dawn meal that would sustain them through the long day of fasting ahead. To make the rising feel less like deprivation and more like participation. Here is your drummer, here is your poet, here is the man whose job is to make sure you eat before the fast begins, because this is what we do for each other, in this neighborhood, in this city, in this month. The child in the wooden house on the hill woke to the sound of the drum and the voice of the outside, and heard her mother already awake and moving in the room, and smelled the first warmth of the brazier being revived, and felt the particular quality of excitement that is specific to the middle of the night in Ramadan, not quite ordinary wakefulness. Something more awake than that, something that belonged to a different time than the everyday. The sahur was eaten in the lamplight. The family sat together in the night, and then the cannon fired again, or the rose, and the day's fast began, and the city turned its face back toward endurance and toward God. Chapter 17: Dreams, Jinn, and What the Dark Contained. The lamp is very low now in most of the houses of the city. The oil is running down. The wick has been trimmed back as far as it will go to conserve what remains until morning. The flame is barely more than a spark of warmth in the room, enough to see the outlines of things, but not to make them sharp. In the Ottoman understanding of the world, the night was not merely a physical absence of light. It was a spiritual territory, one that existed simultaneously with the physical city, but was inhabited by beings and forces that were invisible during the day and closer during the hours of darkness. The jinn, in Islamic theology and Ottoman society, was thoroughly Islamic in its cosmology, Whether educated and orthodox or folk and syncretic, the jinn were real beings, not metaphors, not folk superstitions that educated people privately dismissed. Real entities, created by God from smokeless fire in the same way that humans were created from clay and angels were created from light. The devotes an entire chapter, Surah al-Jinn, to their existence and to their awareness of the revelation brought by the Prophet Muhammad. The jinn could be Muslim or non-Muslim. They could be good or evil. They could intermarry with humans, though this was discouraged. They were morally complex beings subject to divine judgment in the same way that humans were. Their relationship to the night was specific. The jinn were understood to be more active and more present in the hours of darkness, not because darkness was their natural element exactly, but because darkness was the time when the human world relaxed its vigilance, and the boundaries between the visible and invisible worlds grew thinner. A person walking the dark streets alone was more exposed to jinn influence than a person walking in the daytime in a crowd. An empty building at night might be inhabited by jinn who had moved in when humans moved out. The protective practices against jinn were integrated into daily religious life. The Bismillah, the phrase in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, was spoken before entering dark or unfamiliar spaces. The the throne verse of the, was recited before sleep as a protective prayer, understood to create a spiritual shield around the sleeping person through the night. Thus seeking God's protection from the accursed Satan was prescribed at specific moments of the day and night. These practices were not merely folk customs performed by the uneducated. They were integrated into the mainstream religious practice of the Ottoman city. The same who taught interpretation at the madrasa, the religious school, recited before sleeping. The Sultan himself was not exempt from the jinn's potential influence. This is made unusually concrete by an artifact that survives today in the Palace Museum collection. The talismanic shirts of Sultan III, who ruled the Ottoman Empire from 1574 to 1595. These shirts, actually several of them exist in the collection, are linen garments covered from collar to hem with closely written text. Verses, prayers, divine names and attributes, astrological and numerological symbols, all arranged according to a complex logic of spiritual protection. They were made to be worn by the Sultan at times of danger, physical or spiritual, and the protection they were intended to provide was quite specific: against poison, against weapons, against illness, and against the influence of malevolent jinn and magical attack. The existence of these shirts tells us something important, that in the Ottoman world, even at the highest levels of power and education, the spiritual dangers of the night were taken with complete seriousness. This was not superstition separate from religion. It was religion, expressed in the textile arts of a court that believed with full conviction in the reality of an invisible world that was only partly benign. Dreams, too, were taken seriously, not as random neurological events, but as communications. Islamic tradition includes an elaborate science of dream interpretation going back to the Prophet's own reported descriptions of prophetic dreaming. A good dream was understood as a message from God or from a righteous soul, and a bad dream was understood as coming from Shaitan, a device to disturb and distract. The appropriate response to a bad dream was to spit 3 times to the left, to seek refuge in God from Shaitan, and not to recount the dream to anyone, lest giving it language give it power. A person of religious learning who had a significant dream might consult a specialist in dream interpretation, a practice documented in Ottoman sources, where dreams of sultans and officials were sometimes given formal attention. Dreams of water were generally positive. Dreams of blood were concerning. Dreams of the prophet were among the most significant and most carefully transmitted. In the wooden house on the dark street, the family sleeps. The lamp has guttered to almost nothing. The brazier has settled to a bed of faint orange coals. The children breathe evenly. The adults lie in the particular stillness of deep sleep, their faces open and unguarded in a way they never are during the daylight hours. Whatever the night contains, the jinn in the dark corners, the meaning in the dreams, the spiritual territory that begins where the ordinary world ends, it moves through the sleeping city without disturbing it. The city breathes. The city rests. Chapter 18: Sacred Calendars and the Texture of Religious Time. Before the very last chapter, let us sit with the strangeness and the richness of what it meant to be a city where several different sacred calendars ran simultaneously. On Friday night, which in the Islamic tradition is the beginning of the day that follows, because the Islamic day runs from sunset to sunset, the Muslim majority observed a heightened religious attention, though Friday is not a day of rest in the same sense as the Jewish Sabbath or the Christian Sunday. The prayer, the Friday midday congregation prayer, was obligatory for adult Muslim men, and the day had a sacred quality, but the Friday night was not specifically liturgically marked in the way that the Jewish Shabbat was. But on that same Friday night, in the Jewish neighborhoods of Istanbul, and the transformation of Shabbat had already begun at the previous sunset. The Shabbat candles, 2 of them, always 2, lit by the woman of the household in fulfillment of a commandment that predated the Ottoman Empire by more than 2,000 years, burned in the windows. The Shabbat meal had been prepared in advance. No cooking was performed on the Shabbat itself. The family was home. The Torah scrolls in the synagogue were wrapped in their velvet mantles and resting in the ark. They had led the Shabbat prayers that welcomed the Sabbath as a bride coming to her wedding. And on Sunday, 2 days later, the different calendar, the Greek Orthodox and Armenian Christian churches filled in the morning for the divine liturgy. The bells of the Orthodox churches, tolling the call to prayer in their own way, added another layer to the city's sonic texture. The incense that rose from the thuribles during the liturgy drifted out through the church doors into the Sunday morning street. All of these calendars existed simultaneously in the same city, in the same streets. A street inn on a Saturday morning might be wholly quiet in the Jewish quarter, the Shabbat silence, the absence of commerce, while the next street over, in the Greek quarter, was normally busy. On a Friday afternoon, the Muslim call to prayer from the mosque at the end of the street summoned men to congregation, while the Jewish women a few doors away were beginning the Shabbat preparations. The Ottoman administration navigated this complexity through the millet system, the formal recognition of non-Muslim religious communities as self-governing entities in matters of personal law, religious practice, and communal organization. The Greek Orthodox community was governed by the Greek Orthodox Patriarch in Constantinople. The Jewish communities were governed by their rabbis. The Armenian community by the Armenian Patriarch. Each community maintained its own courts for personal matters, marriage, divorce, inheritance, while Ottoman courts handled matters between members of different communities and criminal matters overall. In the daily texture of Istanbul life, what this meant was a kind of parallel living that was both ordinary and extraordinary. Neighbors of different faiths coexisted in the same neighborhoods, bought and sold with each other, sometimes knew each other well, sometimes did not, while each lived within the framework of a sacred calendar and a set of religious obligations that the other did not share. At night, these differences became most visible and least fraught. The Jewish family behind their shutters on Friday night, candles burning, the murmur of the Shabbat songs. The Muslim family a few doors away, the low flame of their lamp, the prayer rug rolled out facing southeast toward Mecca. The sound of a Greek Orthodox woman reciting her evening prayers before her icon shelf, the gold-backed images of Christ and the Virgin gleaming in the lamplight. The city held all of this. It did not always do so without tension or without injustice. The system that guaranteed non-Muslim communities their rights also imposed upon them various disabilities, taxes, and restrictions, and the practical application of tolerance was uneven and depended heavily on the character and preferences of individual officials. But in its deepest aspiration, Ottoman Istanbul was a city that contained multitudes, a city that knew, whatever its officials and scholars sometimes claimed, that the night was large enough to hold more than one kind of prayer. Chapter 19. Dawn, the city wakes. It is the last hour of darkness. You can tell by the quality of the air, not quite a change yet, but a suggestion of one, the darkness slightly less absolute in the east, something not yet visible, but already present in the atmosphere above the temperature has dropped to its lowest point of the night. The dew is on the wooden shutters and the cobblestones and the leaves of the fig tree growing in the corner of the courtyard. The city is more completely asleep now than it has been at any point in the night. Even the coffee houses are dark, even the fires have been banked, even the dervishes have finished there and gone to sleep. The only people awake are those whose work requires it. The bakers have been awake for hours. The neighborhood, the communal bread oven was stoked in the depths of the night, its fire built up to the high heat required for bread, and the dough that was left to rise through the evening is now being shaped and slid into the oven on long-handled wooden paddles. The smell of baking bread has been drifting through the streets for some time already, absorbed into dreams, announcing morning before morning arrives. He is finishing his last round. He is tired, he has been walking since dusk, and the hours of the night weigh on his feet in a way that the first hour's walking never does. His lantern is burning lower than he would like. He has misjudged the oil slightly, and the flame is small and flickering. But he knows these streets well enough to walk them in near darkness. He makes his final circuit of the neighborhood, tapping his staff once more on the familiar cobblestones, and then he goes to his own small room to sleep for a few hours before the day resumes. In the harem of palace, the eunuchs who have guarded the corridors through the night are handing over their posts to the morning watch. The women inside are still mostly asleep, their mattresses arranged on the floors of their rooms, the lamplight barely touching their faces. In the Jewish quarter, the Shabbat candles, if this is a Friday night, have burned down to nothing hours ago. The family sleeps in the darkened room, the Shabbat silence extending into the last moments of the night. In the Coffeehouse Inn, the owner is asleep in his back room, but he will be up soon. There is cleaning to do before the first customers arrive at dawn, and the coffee needs to be roasted and ground, and the fire built up for the first pot. And then, from the minaret of the nearest mosque, not the great knot, but the small neighborhood mosque just up the hill, the one whose muezzin you heard at sunset last night, the begins. The dawn prayer call is different from the others. The same words are there, God is greater, announced 4 times. The same invitation, come to prayer, come to prosperity. But between these, in the call only, there is an addition, as min and prayer is better than sleep. This phrase, recited only in the dawn call, has a quality that is different from every other element of the. It is not a theological statement about the nature of God. It is a practical address to the specific difficulty of the moment. It is hard to wake from sleep. It is hard to leave warmth and comfort and the particular fog of the early morning. Here is a reason. Here is an acknowledgement that what is being asked is difficult, and here, offered simply and without apology, is the reason it is worth doing anyway. Prayer is better than sleep. Over the rooftops of the city, the is spreading as it always does, first one minaret, then another, then the great mosques taking up the call, the echoes layering until the sky above the sleeping city is woven through with sound. The birds are beginning, too, the first notes of the blackbirds and the sparrows that live in the gardens of the mosque courtyards, awakened by the first imperceptible changes in the light. Below in the streets, the gates of the city walls are being unlocked. The great iron bolts slide back with a sound like a settling stone. The heavy wooden doors swing open, and the cold morning air moves through the gate in both directions at once, out toward the gardens and fields and roads beyond the walls, in toward the sleeping city. Travelers who have been waiting outside since dusk, merchants with their pack animals, pilgrims, message carriers, file through the opening gates and enter the city that is just waking. The Grand Bazaar's night guards are making their final round of the lanes. In an hour, the guild officials will arrive with their keys to begin the morning unlocking of the gates. The silks and jewels and spices inside have spent the night undisturbed. A baker, carrying a tray of fresh flatbreads on his head, comes around the corner and walks through the neighborhood calling out in a low voice, not quite the full cry of the daytime bread seller, but something softer, appropriate to the hour, an invitation rather than an announcement. A door opens, a hand reaches out, a coin changes hands. The smell of fresh bread lingers in the cold air of the street long after the baker has turned the corner. In the wooden houses, the first sounds of waking, a child coughing, the thud of feet on bare floorboard, water being poured into a basin, the particular domestic sound of a household beginning to assemble itself from the pieces of the night, the mattresses rolled back into the wall cabinets, the carpet smoothed, the lamp refilled for the day. The light is coming. Not quickly, not as a rush or a flood, but slowly, as it always comes here over the water. that takes the color first. The eastern sky above Asia turning from black to a very deep blue, and then to a purple that is less dark, and then to a blue that is recognizably a daytime color, and then the first gold at the horizon, and then the dome of a catching the light and holding it, glowing, for a few minutes before the sun is fully up, while the rest of the city below is still in the shadow of the hill. The greatest city in the world has survived another night. Chapter 20, Closing. We have spent the night here together. You have walked the streets of Ottoman Istanbul, the cobblestones under your feet, the lantern light moving ahead of you, the tap of the staff marking the hours. You have sat in the warmth of the coffeehouse and listened to the chess pieces move on the board and the story being told in the corner. You have smelled the bread baking in the neighborhood oven, the steam of the charcoal smoke of 1,000 braziers in 1,000 wooden houses on 1,000 narrow streets. You have heard the many, layered over each other across the sleeping city. You have heard the band playing from the tower, the drum of the Ramadan moving through the street before dawn. You have seen the lights between the minarets and the candles in the Jewish windows on Friday night and the lamp burning in the corner of the Sultan's tiled chamber. All of this happened. Not once, not in a single night, but again and again, hundreds of thousands of nights, across the decades of his reign and the centuries of the empire he served. The city that held 300,000 people in the 1550s went on holding people, different buildings, different songs and prayers and arguments and silences, for centuries more. What strikes me, thinking about Ottoman Istanbul at night, is not the strangeness of it, though it is strange in all the ways that any fully imagined past is strange to the present. What strikes me is the density of life, the richness of it, how much was happening at once. The dervishes spinning in the candlelit, while the made his rounds, while the baker stirred the fire, while the family of 5 slept on their mattresses on the floor of their wooden house, while the Sultan lay in his tiled room listening to the sound of the while the Jewish grandmother murmured her prayers in a language that the neighbors could not understand. All of it simultaneous, all of it real. The night held all of it. And perhaps this is the thing worth carrying into sleep, the image of this enormous, complicated, alive city, in the darkness before electricity and before the speed of the modern world, going about the ancient business of being human, sleeping and waking and praying and eating and watching and turning and dreaming, in the warm dark of a May night in 1550, while the stars came out above the Golden Horn and the water moved through the without stopping on its way from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, just as it has always moved and will always move, regardless of do or do not do on its shores. Let the sound of that water take you now. Let the last notes of the fade into the air of the. Let the staff tap once more on the far cobblestones and then grow distant and then stop. The city breathes. You breathe with it. There is something worth knowing about sleep itself in the Ottoman world, and it is this: the division of the night into the 2 sleeps, the first sleep and the second sleep, which historians of sleep have documented across many pre-industrial societies, was likely common here too, though the Ottoman sources do not name it in those terms. People went to sleep after the prayer in the early evening, and many woke naturally in the deep middle of the night, in the quiet hour or 2 hours, to pray thee if they were devout, or simply to lie awake for a time in the darkness, calm, unhurried, not anxious as we might be about waking in the night, and then to return to sleep for the hours before the. This meant that the deep hours of the night were not necessarily hours of continuous unconsciousness. They were hours of altered consciousness, the prayer whispered in the dark room while the household slept, the traveler lying awake in the khan watching the stars through a gap in the roof, the scholar rising to read by the smallest light, the nursing mother in the harem dormitory settling a waking child. The night was not simply a long gap between one day and the next. It was its own life, its own territory, with its own quality of attention. What that attention felt like, what it was like to be awake in the Ottoman night, in the small hours, in the wooden house or the stone palace or the guard's post at the city gate, we cannot know with precision. The interior life of the past is always partly inaccessible. What we have are the structures, the institutions, the material evidence, the administrative records, the travelers' accounts, and the poets' verses, and the chronicles of plague and prayer. From these we assemble something, not a perfect copy of the experience, but an approximation, a shadow cast by what once stood in the light. And that shadow is enough. It is more than enough, on a night like this, in the quiet hour, to let the shape of that world rest in the mind. The tiled rooms and the wooden houses and the steam of and the whirling white robes and the staff on the cobblestones, and feel it as a presence, something real that happened, people who lived and slept and prayed and worried and rested and woke again, over and over, in the greatest city of their world. The night is very long and very gentle, and there is nowhere you need to be until morning. Sleep well. End of script. 15 Ottoman Nights.